Hey guys, what's going on? It's Dave from Evil Eye Games. Today we're going to continue on with making the menu. Right now, if we hit play and we go into our settings, we can manipulate these settings, but these settings don't actually apply to the game, and they don't actually store the values. So even if we hit the apply button, back out, and we go back into our settings, it's not retaining any of this information, because right now our settings menu is getting destroyed every time we hit the back button. So, in order to do this, we're going to utilize a save game file to retain the information that we want to store for our settings. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and right-click on our content folder. I'm going to add a new folder, and I'm going to call this our save game files. In this folder, we're going to store all of the save games and the blueprints for adding our data. So in the main content window here, I'm going to right click and we're going to add a new blueprint class. And under all classes, we're going to search for save game. We're going to select it, hit the select button, and I'm going to call this the settings save game. One thing to note with the save game, you never want to leave it with a default save game name. That will cause issues. So I'm going to go ahead and we're going to double click the settings save game to open it. And basically what this is doing is this is kind of like a blueprint that is going to hold all of the variables that we want to save. So we're going to want to make some variables, but I'm going to want to do them in such a way that we can access them in groups rather than just accessing a single variable at any given time. We can go ahead and just add all the variables that exist within our settings menu to this, but it's going to get very messy and there's going to be a lot of variables. So we're going to go back to our main window. I'm going to right click and I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call this folder structs. And our structs are going to contain structures, which we haven't used before. And in order to create one, we're going to right click. We're going to go to blueprints and we're going to select structure. And for the first one, I'm going to call this our graphics setting struct. And then we're going to go ahead and double click on it to open it. And what a structure is it's kind of like an array where it will hold multiple values, except we set the size of the structure ahead of time, and we can set what type of variables the structure can hold. So for this one, we're going to hold all of our graphic settings that we had from before. So I'm going to go ahead and add a new variable for each one of the variables in our graphic settings menu. The first one is going to be our resolution index. And this is going to be of a type integer. Our second one is going to be our anti-aliasing. And this is going to be our high, medium, low enum. The next one is going to be our post-processing. And then we're going to have our shadow quality. And then we're going to have our texture quality. And finally, the effects quality. And each one of these is going to be our high, medium, low enum. And that's all we're going to really need to do. So we'll go ahead and hit save. And we can close out of this structure. And then we're also going to want to go ahead and create a structure for our sound settings. So right click, go to blueprints and structure. I'm going to call this our sound settings struct. I'm going to open it up, and I have 3 sound settings, so I'm going to add 2 more variables to this. We'll have the master volume. We'll have the SFX volume. And finally, we'll have the music volume. And all three of these are going to be floats. And I'm going to go ahead and save. And we can close out of our sound settings struct. And lastly, we're going to go ahead and we're going to make a control settings struct. So once again, we'll go to Blueprints, Structure. We'll name it our control settings struct. And then we'll go ahead and open it up. And we'll have two variables. One of them is going to be our mouse sensitivity. And that's going to be a float. And the other one is going to be the invert mouse. So we can go ahead and save this and close out. Now in our settings save game file, we're going to have to add variables to this. So I'm going to add a new variable. And we're going to call this the saved graphics setting. And for the type, we're going to search for the graphics settings struct. We're going to add another one. We're going to add a saved sound settings. And for the type, we're going to find our sound settings struct. And then finally, we're going to have our saved control settings. And we will, for the type, set it to our control settings struct. And we can go ahead and compile and save this. And that's all we need to do to save things. But like I mentioned before, we don't want to set variables in other blueprints from other blueprints. We want to call upon the blueprint that contains the variable and have it set it. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to create a new function. And I'm going to call this set graphics settings. And I'm basically going to grab our saved graphics settings here. We're going to go ahead and set it. And then we're just going to take our saved graphics settings and plug it in as an input. And we can rename this input to just graphics settings. And we can go ahead and add another variable. And we're going to call it set sound settings. Same thing, we're just going to grab and set our saved sound settings. And we're going to go ahead and plug the saved sound settings into our input. And then I'm just going to go ahead and rename it to just sound settings. And then finally, we're going to add one last function. It's going to be set control settings. So we'll grab our saved control settings. We'll set it. And then plug our saved control settings into the input. And I'll just rename it down to control settings. And we're going to go ahead and compile and save. And that's really all we have to do in our save game file. So now we have a way to store the information we want to store. And we have a method of setting those variables that we want to save. So I'm going to go ahead and close out of our settings save game. And now we have to have a way to go ahead and tell the save game to save and to pull the data from it. And we want to put it in a place where anything that we need it to can access it. Because we're going to need two places that are going to have to apply the graphics settings. We're going to need it in the main menu. So when the game first launches, one of the first things it's going to need to do when the menu loads is go ahead and set all of the graphics settings that we had saved. And we're going to need to do this within our widget for our settings as well. And then when we go ahead and pull the settings for our controls, we're going to need to do that in the player controller. So the one overarching thing that we're going to have is if we go into our game files, we have our 3P game instance that we created early on. And the game instance is going to be used to store any kind of data that's going to be overarching for the entirety of the game. So the game instance is basically created when the game is initially run, and it will persist all the way until the game is closed. So any kind of data that you have that's going to overarch the entirety of the game, we want to use the game instance to give other blueprints access to that information. And the game instance can be accessed from pretty much every blueprint that there is out there. So I'm going to go ahead and we're going to double click on our game instance. And we're going to click to open the full blueprint editor. And we want to use this to give access to our save game settings, and we also want to create some functions to save and load our save game settings. So the first function we're going to go ahead and create, I'm going to call this Does Saved Settings Exist? And we're going to use this to check to see whether there is already a save settings. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to drag out from our execution pin, and we're going to search for a Does Save Game Exist? And it's going to request a slot name and a user index. And for the slot name, this is something that's going to have to remain consistent across all fronts. So in our slot, I'm just going to go ahead and type in saved game settings. And then because we want this to remain consistent, I'm going to go ahead and promote this to a variable. And I'm going to call this the saved settings slot name. So whenever we have to call upon the slot name in the future, we can just use this variable instead of typing it in and risking making a typo. The user index can be used to store multiple versions of the same setting info. This is particularly useful if you've ever seen the game where you go to load a game and it'll give you slot 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. This is where it would be useful. But for our save game settings, we're going to not really need that. So we can just leave it at the user index of 0. And then we're going to go ahead and put in a branch. And we're going to connect our Does Save Game Exist into our branch, as well as the return value into the condition. And we're going to want to do one of two things based on whether our save game already exists. So if it already does exist, from our true pin here, we're going to drag out, and we're going to go ahead and load game from slot. And we're going to go ahead and plug in our save games name setting slot. And we're going to leave the user index at 0. And then we're going to go ahead and drag off from our return value, and we're going to go ahead and cast this to our save game settings. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to promote this to a variable so we can reference it. And I'm just going to call this the settings save game. And that's all we're going to do for our true. Now in the event that a save settings does not exist, we're going to go ahead and we're going to drag off from our false pin here. And we're going to go ahead and create a save game object. And we're going to have to select a class. So we're going to select our settings save game. And then we're going to want to go ahead and cast to our settings save game. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to set our settings save game. And at this point, since we just created this, we're going to want to go ahead and set the default settings for our save game file. So, as our settings save game, we're going to drag out and we're going to search for set control settings. So we created that function within our settings save game file, and we're going to have to plug in some control settings. So I'm going to drag out from our control settings here, and I'm going to select make. And so we can go ahead and set in our default values here. So I'm going to set the mouse sensitivity to 1, and invert mouse is going to be unchecked. Next, we're going to go ahead and set the default settings for our sound. So we'll drag off from our settings save game here. We're going to search for set sound, and we'll select our set sound settings. And then once again, we're going to drag out from our sound settings, and we're going to select make. And we can set the default values for all of our volumes. So I'm just going to put it as, we'll just say 75 for all the volumes for now. And then we're going to want to go ahead and set our graphic settings. So I'm going to drag out, and I'm going to give myself some room here. And I'm going to drag off of our settings save game. And then we're going to have to go ahead and break this apart. So we're going to drag out from our graphic settings. We're going to select make. And we're going to have to click the down arrow to show all of the options. And I am fine with all of the default options being high. But we do have to set the resolution index. And that's what we're going to need a little bit of room for. So from our set sound settings, I'm going to drag out. And we're going to go ahead and get supported full screen resolutions. And I want to initially set it to the native resolution of the display that they're working with. So we're going to drag out from our resolutions. We're going to search for the last index. And we're going to go ahead and set our last index into the resolution index. And then we can just neaten this up a little bit. So, to summarize what we're doing, when we run the does save settings exist, we're going to go ahead and we're going to check to see if our save game does exist in our slot. If it does exist, we're going to go ahead and load that game from slot. We're going to cast it to our save game type, and we're going to save a reference to it. If the save game does not exist, we travel down the false branch. We're going to go ahead and create a save game object. We're going to go ahead and cast to our save game settings. We're going to set it as our variable. We're going to set the defaults for our control settings, for our sound settings, and for our graphic settings. And the only real thing we're going to have to do to get the resolution is we're just going to get the last index from the resolutions available for full screen supported. So the next thing we're going to want to do is we want to add a function to actually save our settings. So under functions, I'm going to add a new function, and I'm going to call this save settings. And I'm going to click on our input here, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to add 3 inputs. The first one is going to be our graphic settings. And that's going to be of type graphics settings struct. Our second is going to be our sound settings. And that's going to be of the type our sound settings struct. And lastly, we're going to have our control settings. And that's going to be of the type our control settings struct. So we're going to go ahead, we're going to get our reference to our settings save game. And then we're going to call the set graphic settings. And we're simply going to plug the execution pin in and plug our graphic settings into the input on our set graphic settings. We're then going to go ahead and set sound settings. And once again, we're just going to go ahead and plug in the execution pin and connect the input sound settings to the input on our set sound settings. And then finally, we're going to set the control settings. And once again, we're just going to plug our control settings into there. And we can use some rewrote nodes to go ahead and clean this up a little bit. And then finally, what we're going to need to do is we're going to actually have to call on saving the game. So we're going to drag off of our set control settings here, and we're going to search for a save game to slot. So we're going to have to tell it what object. So I'm going to take our settings save game, and we're going to plug that into our object. And then for the slot name, we're going to go ahead and grab our save settings slot name and plug that in place. And that is essentially going to be it. So when we call to save the settings, we're going to go ahead and we're going to take the inputs for our settings. We're going to go ahead and set the graphics settings. We're going to set the sound settings, and we'll set the control settings in our actual save game file. And then we're going to go ahead and call a save game to slot in that file. And we're going to go ahead and compile and save, and we can close out of this function. And I want to create another function, and I'm going to call this get save settings. Now, we don't have direct access to the save settings, and to make it much cleaner, we're just going to go ahead and create a function that will return what our save graphics settings are if we ever need them. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add an input, so we add in a return node here and delete it. And what we're going to end up doing is we're going to grab the settings save game, and then we're going to get the graphics. We're going to get the sound. And then we're going to go ahead and get the control settings. And then we're simply going to plug these into our return node as outputs. And that's going to be it. We're just going to compile and save. And I'll close that function out. Now, the last one we're going to have to create is going to be a bit more complex. And this one we're going to call the apply graphics settings. So we're going to set up an input, and we're going to call this our graphics settings. And for the type, it's going to be our graphics struct. So from our graphics settings input here, I'm going to drag out, and we're going to go ahead and break this and hit the little down arrow to show all the values. We're going to have to go ahead and actually put these into place. So before, I showed you the scalability reference that is available on UE4's wiki. So we're going to bring that up right now because we're going to need the command lines for setting our graphics settings. So if I bring up my web browser here, and I'm going to go ahead and drag it off to the side so we can reference it as we go through it. It does not have the command for setting the resolution, which is the first one we're going to do. But in order to set the resolution, we're going to drag out from our execution pin here, and we're going to have to get the supported full screen resolutions. And then we're going to go on to go ahead and from the resolutions drag out and get. And we'll plug the resolution index from our graphics struct into the index number. We're going to go ahead and we're going to break our result. And then we're going to want to go ahead and search for an append. And we want to append a string. And here's where it's going to get fun, because we actually have to build the command line for setting the resolution. So we're going to need a total of 5 pins. So we're going to need an A, B, C, D, and an E. For the A pin, we're going to enter the first command of the line, or the first part of the command, and it's going to be an R period set RES and then a space. We're then going to go ahead and connect our X resolution into the B pin and our Y resolution into the D pin. And then for the C here, we're going to insert the lowercase letter x. And then finally on the E string here, we're going to go ahead and insert the lowercase letter f. And what this command is going to do is it will perform the command line r.setRes with a space after it. This is very important. You do have to put that space in there. It's going to continue building the line. So it's going to take our x resolution, put in a lowercase x in between it, and take our y resolution, insert it, and then it's going to end the command line with the letter F, which is going to denote full screen. Now you can also set it to run in full screen, windowed, full screen, or just windowed mode. But I don't think we really need to add that feature in for the game. So from our supported full screen resolutions execution pin, I'm going to drag out, and we're going to search for an execute console command. And we're going to go ahead and plug our return value into this command. And there's also an option for a specific player, but we're not going to need to use that because this is a single player game. And then after setting the resolution, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add in a sequence. And for our sequence here, we're going to need 5 pins, 1 for each of the remaining effects. And then we're going to have to draw out from here, and we're going to have to create a switch. So I'll drag off the anti-aliasing here, and I'm going to search for a switch. And we'll plug this into our then 0. And from here, we're going to go ahead and we're going to drag out of the high, and we're going to execute console command. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to duplicate this for each the high, medium, and low, because we are going to need a different console command based off of whether it's a high setting, a medium setting, or a low setting. And this is where our scalability reference on the right-hand side is going to come into play. If we scroll down to where the anti-aliasing is, it gives you the command here, the r.postprocess quality, or I'm sorry, it's r.postprocess AA quality. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this. And I'm going to go ahead and paste it into place. And then we're going to have a space. And then for the settings here, it dictates what the different settings are. So there is a 6 as being the highest setting, and a 0 as being the lowest setting. Now, in all the cases of these, I'm going to ignore the lowest setting. So my high is going to be what in the editor is referred to as epic, and my low is going to be the medium setting. So for the high, I'm going to add in a space and the number 6, and then we can go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and paste in the command line for our medium. And I'll put in a space and the number 4. And then finally for the remaining command, I'll put in a space and the number 2. And we have 4 remaining commands. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to grab this, and I'm going to go ahead and duplicate it for each one of our settings. And then we can go ahead and for each one connect the next then pin into each one of these settings. And then we're going to have to connect the appropriate setting from our graphics struct into each one of these. All right, so once we have that done, we're going to have to manipulate the command lines that we're running for each one of these. So as we go down, the next one we have is post-processing. So this switch should be plugged into the post-processing. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to simply copy this line, the sg.postprocessQuality, and I'm going to go ahead and paste it in place. And for this setting, there is a setting of 0, 1, 2, and 3. 3 being the highest quality, and 0 being the lowest quality. So for my highest setting, I'm going to insert a space and the number 3. For my medium, I'm going to put in a space and the number 2. And finally, for the last one, I'll put in a space and the number 1. And then we're going to continue on with each one of these settings. So shadow quality is next. I'll go ahead and copy that line. We're going to paste it into place, add a space and the number 3. And then for medium, a space and the number 2. And finally, for the low, a space and the number 1. Then we have our texture quality. We'll copy that. Paste it into place, space and a 3. Paste it into place, a space and a 2 for medium. Paste it into place and a space and a 1 for low. And that's going to leave our last setting, the effects quality. So I'll go ahead and copy that. We'll paste it into place, a space and a 3. Paste it into place and a space and a 2 for medium. And then paste it into place, a space and a 1 for low. And we can use to kind of tidy it up a little bit. So to summarize what we're doing, we're going to go ahead and we're going to break out our graphics settings struct that's on our input. We're going to get the supported full screen resolutions, and from that array, we're going to get our current resolution index that we're using. We're going to break it apart, and we're going to build a command from it. So it will r.setRes space x value of our resolution. In between that, there's going to be an x, and then the y value. And then finally, we're going to add an F on the end to make it full screen. And then we're going to execute the console command that we just created. We're then going to go into a sequence, and we're going to go ahead and perform a switch on the setting that we're pulling from our graphics setting structure. So for each one, we're going to perform a different console command, depending on whether the setting is high, medium, or low. And we're going to perform that for each one of our settings. And I would double check on all of these settings here. You're going to want to make sure that is typed out specifically the way it is. And also that there's a space between the end of the command and the value of the setting. So for the r.postprocess AA quality, there's a space and then the number of the setting. And it's going to be the same way for each one of the other settings as well. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and compile and save, and we'll close out of our game instance because that's going to be everything we need. And then I'm going to go back into our HUD folder, and we're going to go ahead and open up our settings menu widget. And I'm just going to expand this because we're not going to need our document anymore. So if we go into our graph, and on our main event graph here, the first thing I want to take care of is saving our settings. So when we click the back button, all we're simply doing is removing ourselves from the parent. But I want to change that, so I'm going to go ahead and break this link. And I'm going to drag out from our back button, and we're going to perform a sequence. Now we're going to end up removing from parent last, so I'm going to drag the then 1 pin down to our remove from parent. And I want to make sure that there's a check to see if the graphics settings have been applied yet. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a new variable, and it's going to be a Boolean, and we're going to call it graphics settings applied. And I'm going to compile because I want to set the default value of this, and I want to set it to true. And what we're going to do with this is we're going to check to see if we've applied our graphics settings after a setting has changed. So I'm going to go into our graphics pane real fast. And what we want to do is every time we change any one of these settings, we want to go ahead and make sure that the graphics setting applied is set to false. So we'll open up our pre-next resolution setting. And then at the very end here, I'm just going to go ahead and set the graphics settings applied to false. And we're going to go ahead and plug it in at the end, so we always set it to false. And then I'm going to close this function. And then we're going to have to do the same thing with our previewed next high, medium, low setting. So for this, I'm just going to go ahead and add another pin into our sequence. And I'll shift this over a little bit. And we're going to go ahead and drag in a set for our graphics settings applied. We'll go ahead and plug it in and make sure it's set to false. And we'll compile and save. And we'll close out of that function. So now every time we change anything on the graphics menu, it's going to go ahead and set that value to false. So back in our event graph, when we click the back button, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get our graphics settings applied variable. We're going to throw in a branch. And we're going to check to see if our graphics settings have been applied. And we're going to need to get a reference to our game instance. So I'm going to go to the top, and on our event construct here, I'm going to right click, and we are going to search for game instance, and we will get game instance. And we're going to need to go ahead and cast this to our 3P game instance. And then I'm going to go ahead and promote this to a variable. And we'll just call it our game instance. So now we have a variable that can reference our game instance. So we're going to come back down here. And after our branch, if it's true, we're going to go ahead and get a reference to our game instance. And we're going to go ahead and call save settings. And we're going to plug our true pin into the save settings. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to have to create these graphic settings here. So I'm going to move that remove parent from widget out of the way, and I'm going to drag this off a little bit. And we're going to have to drag this out, and we're going to have to make each one of these structs. And then we're going to go ahead and plug all of the variables that we have into this structs. So we'll grab our control resolution, or our current resolution index, and plug that in. Our anti-aliasing, our post-processing, our shadow quality, our texture quality, and our effects quality. And then we're also going to plug in our volumes. And then finally, we're going to plug in our mouse sensitivity and invert mouse into the control settings struct. And we can go ahead and just space these out a little bit so that we can read them easily. And then we're going to have to deal with what happens when our graphic settings haven't been applied. So we're going to go ahead and I'm just going to move this over a little bit out of the way for now. And if it's false, we're going to go ahead and I'm going to grab our game instance here. And we're going to get save settings. And we're going to plug our false pin into this get save settings. And then we're also going to grab off our game instance, and we're going to find the save settings. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to plug our save graphic settings directly into the graphic settings. But I want the sound and the controls to not be dependent on hitting the apply button when we apply the graphics. So, from making our structs over here, we're simply going to grab these and we're going to plug these into our sound and our control settings. Alright, to summarize what we're doing, when we click the back button, we're going to go ahead and we're going to check to see if our graphic settings have been applied. If they have been, we're just going to basically create structs for our graphic settings, our sound settings, and our control settings, and feed the results into save settings, which we're going to call on the game instance. Then if that's false, we're going to go ahead and get our save settings, and we're going to directly plug our save graphic settings into the graphic settings, and then we're going to just save our current volume and our current sensitivity and invert mouse for our control settings. Next, we're going to go into our graphics settings, and we're going to go in, so we'll go into our graphics pane, and we have to handle what happens when we hit the apply button. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to grab a reference to our game instance, and we want to drag out and we want to search for apply graphic settings. So we created this function in order to apply all of our settings. So once again, we're going to have to drag out from our graphic settings, and we're going to have to make our graphic settings struct. And for this, we're just simply going to go ahead and plug our settings into the appropriate input on the struct. And then we want to go ahead and we want to set the graphic settings applied, and we want to set this back to true. So when we hit that apply button, we have applied our settings, so that when we go to hit back and it goes to save the settings, it's going to know that we did go ahead and apply our settings. And the last thing we're going to want to do is we want to go back to our event graph, and up at the top here for our event construct, we're going to have to go ahead and actually check to see if a save game does exist. So from our game instance, we're going to drag out and we're going to search for our does save game exist, or our save settings exist. So that's going to run the check. That's going to see if the save settings file exists, and if it does, it's going to load it up. And then we want to drag out from our game instance, and we want to go ahead and get save settings. And now we want to actually take the return from this get save settings, and we want to apply this to our variables that we have in our menu. So when this menu loads up, we want the values to be what the save settings are. So I'm going to go ahead and we're going to create a new function. And this function is going to be called set settings values. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to select it, and we're going to add an input, and we're going to call this our graphic settings. And it's going to be of type graphics settings struct. We'll add a new input. We're going to call this our sound settings. And for the type, it's going to be our sound settings struct. And the last one is going to be our control settings. And it's going to be of type control settings struct. And this is going to be pretty easy. All we're going to really need to do is we're going to drag out, and I'm going to call on a sequence. And that's the wrong thing. So we'll call on our sequence, and the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to break the graphic setting, and we'll expand it out. And we just want to go ahead and set all these values. So we're going to have to drag out and set our current resolution index. And for this one, it's going to be a little more complicated because we have to fill out the current resolution string as well. So after we set our current resolution string, we're going to go ahead and get the supported full screen resolutions. And then from that, we're going to go ahead and we're going to get, and we're going to get our current resolution index. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to break it. And then we're going to go ahead and build an append. And that's the wrong one. So append string. We'll add a new pin, and the value of B is going to be the lowercase letter x. And we'll plug our X into A and our Y into C, just like we've done before. And then we're going to use this, and we're going to set the current resolution text. And we'll plug that in from our get full screen supported resolutions. And from this point on, we're just going to go ahead and set each one of our other settings. So for the anti-aliasing, the post-processing, the shadow quality, the texture quality, and finally the effects quality. So we'll just simply plug these guys in here. And then we're going to have to drag over from our break struct and plug each one of these in. And then we can add in some reroute nodes to make it a little easier to manage. All right, so that looks pretty organized. So we're then going to have to go ahead and I'm going to add another pin to our sequence here. And we're going to have to apply our sound settings. So from our then one pin here, we're going to go ahead and drag out. And we're going to, actually, we'll just connect it to our master volume. So we'll go ahead and get our, we're going to go ahead and set our master volume, and we'll plug our then one pin into the master volume. And we're going to take our sound settings, and we're going to go ahead and break this. And because our volumes are sliders, we're going to have to go ahead and set the value of the sliders as well. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to plug our master volume into the set master volume. Then we're going to go ahead and we're going to find our master volume slider. And we're going to get a reference to this. And from our master volume slider, we want to drag out. And we want to go ahead and set value. And we'll plug this in. And we can connect our master volume straight into the in value. And then we're going to have to do the same thing with the SFX volume and the music volume as well. And we'll get references to the music slider as well as the SFX slider. And I'm just going to duplicate this set value. We'll plug the slider into each one. And the value from each into the set value. And then we'll hook up the values from our struct into each one of the sets. And then we can kind of clean it up. So when we're grabbing these values, we're also going to go ahead and set the sliders as well. And then I'm going to just grab this and drag it over a little bit more so it's out of our way. And we can add another reroute node here. And then we're going to have to grab the values for our control settings and set them as well. And so I'm going to drag out from our control settings. We're going to go ahead and break this. And then we're going to have to set each one of these values. So we'll go ahead and set our mouse sensitivity and we'll set our invert mouse. And for our mouse sensitivity, we're going to have to go ahead and apply the slider value as well. So first we'll connect our then 2 pin up to our set mouse sensitivity. And we can't directly connect our mouse sensitivity to this value, because if you remember, we ended up converting this value over to a 0.5 to a 2 value. So the slider is going to be between a 0 and a 1. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to plug our mouse sensitivity in. So we set it, and then we're going to have to find our mouse sensitivity slider. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to get a reference to our slider. We're going to go ahead and we're going to set the value. And then in between setting the value for this, we're going to have to go ahead and map it to a new range. And I'm going to select Map Range Clamped. We'll fit that right in place, and we'll plug the return value to our in value. And then for the in range, we set it to be between 0.5 and 2. And then for the out range, I'm going to go ahead and set this to 0 and 1. So it's going to take our 0.5 to our 2 value and convert it over to a range within 0 and 1. Next, we're going to have to go ahead and plug in our invert mouse. So we're going to go ahead and set this. And we're going to have to set the checkbox on our invert mouse. So let's find our invert mouse checkbox. So we're going to get a reference to that. And we're going to want to put a branch in for this one. And we're going to connect our invert mouse into that branch. And from our invert mouse checkbox here, we're going to drag out, and we're going to set checked state. So we'll plug it into true, and we're going to duplicate it and plug the other one into false and connect up our targets. Now, if invert mouse is true, we want to set the state to checked. And if it's false, we want to set it to unchecked. And I'll go ahead and compile and save. And maybe a few more rewrote nodes to nicen things up a little bit. All right, so what we're doing when we set the values is first we're coming in. We're going to have an input of our graphic settings. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to get the resolution index. We're going to get our supported full screen resolutions, and we'll get the settings for that index. We're going to break apart the X and the Y and set the current resolution. We're then going to just set the anti-aliasing, the post-processing, the shadow quality, the texture quality, and the effects quality variables from our graphics struct. For our volume, we're going to go ahead and break it apart. We're going to set our master volume, and then we're going to go ahead and set the volume slider. And I almost forgot about this, but these are not in the same ranges either. So we're going to have to do a little bit of an update to this. So we're going to go ahead, and I'm just going to copy this map range clamped. And we'll put the value to the input. And the input range is going to be between 0 and 100. And we want the new range to be between 0 and 1. And we're going to plug that return value into our set value for our volume slider. So I'm just going to drag this down here. And then we're going to have to do the same thing with our SFX and our music slider. So we'll go ahead and we will put in a map range clamped. And we'll plug in the value. And the values of the in ranges are going to stay the same from our map range on our master volume. And then we'll duplicate again for our music volume. And I'm just going to reorganize a tad. So, with the new updated system, we're going to go ahead and we break out our sound settings. We're going to set our master volume. And then we're going to go ahead and remap that so that it fits between the 0 and the 1 range for our slider. And we'll set our slider to that value. And then we're going to do the same thing with our SFX volume and our music volume. We're just taking the value, we're setting it to what's coming in on the input, and then we're remapping it to a range, and then setting the value on the slider itself. And then for our control settings struct, we're breaking out the mouse sensitivity, we're remapping it, and setting the value. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to set the value of invert mouse, and then if invert mouse is true, we're going to set the checkbox to checked. If it's false, we're going to set it to unchecked. So I'm going to go ahead and close out of this, and we'll go back to our event graph. So after we get the settings, we're going to want to call this function to set our settings values. And we're just going to straight up plug the settings in appropriately. So at this point, everything should be all set to go. So down here on our clicked over back button, I'm going to go ahead and put a comment box around that, and we'll just call this the back button. I'm going to go ahead and do our graphics pane, and we're going to put a comment box around this, and we'll call it the apply button. And I believe that is it. Let's go ahead and we're going to compile and we're going to save. And we're going to go ahead and hit play. And one thing I want to warn you about ahead of time is this is going to break our heads-up display when we resize the values. And we'll see how that looks like, and then we'll go in and we'll adjust it. But if we hit play and we go to our settings, we're going to go ahead and hit apply, and it looks like we haven't set up the game instance yet, so we're going to have to take care of that. So we're going to go to edit, and we're going to go to project settings, and we're going to go to maps and modes, and at the bottom here we have a game instance class. We're going to want to go ahead and set this over to our 3P game instance. So we can close out of that, and let's try it again. So if we hit play, we're going to go to settings. It's going to show everything, but it isn't actually applying it yet. And this is a weird thing. In the preview mode, which I'm using right now, it doesn't always apply the graphic settings. It's really weird. And I don't know why it's doing that, but we have another way to test it out. So we can change these settings around here. And if we go ahead and hit apply, it's going to change the resolution of the screen, and you'll notice that the display is going off screen here. But to check to see if all of our settings applied, I'm going to hit the tilde key twice. And that's going to show us that the commands were run to set res, set the post-process AA quality, and set all of our other settings. So it is calling on these successfully. So I'm going to hit the tilde key again to go ahead and hide it. And if we hit apply again, we're going to go down to a settings where we can see all of our options here. And I'm going to crank this back up to my full screen. And I'm going to go ahead and we'll go back. And if we go back into our settings menu, it'll have saved all of our settings. We can go into sound. We show the defaults at being 75. I'm going to go ahead and mess those up. I'm going to invert the mouse, and I'm going to change our mouse sensitivity. And we can change these all down to low too, and hit apply. And if I hit back, we can go back into our settings menu. All of our settings are back down to low. Our sound settings are saved. And our control settings are saved as well. So I'm just going to set this back here because it is going to save it. And I'm going to exit out. And we're going to have to do something to go ahead and fix our HUD. And the reason our HUD is breaking is if we go into the designer, the very root item we have at the top here under the widget is the canvas panel. And the canvas panel does not scale with a change in resolution. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to replace that canvas panel. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to right click on the canvas panel and I'm going to select replace with overlay. Now it's going to automatically squash everything down because it's going to lose all of our size settings. But if we expand that out, I'm going to select the image here and I'm going to set it to fill horizontally and vertically. And then we'll go ahead and select the vertical box and I'm going to set to expand that horizontally and vertically as well. And I will compile and save, and it fills out the entirety of our screen here. I'm going to go back to our main window. We're going to have to do this on our main menu widget as well. So I'm going to grab the canvas panel on that. I'm going to replace with an overlay. Once again, it's going to super squash everything, but I'm going to select the image and go ahead and fill it out. Select the vertical box, and we're going to go ahead and fill that out as well. And we will compile and save. And I'll close that out. And this is also going to break our gameplay widget as well. But I'm going to have something new to do with the gameplay widget, and I'll probably just put together a short video on that to follow up with this one. But now if we go into our play and we go into our settings, I'm going to go ahead and resize this and hit apply. And now our menu actually fits into the window. So if I hit back, all of our buttons still fit in the screen. If we go into settings and we can change up the resolution again and hit apply, once again, our overlay resizes to the size of the screen. And we're going to hit back and we're going to hit exit. And one last thing I want to address is in our settings menu widget, we're going to go to our graph, and in the bindings we created earlier, we were getting the text for our high, medium, low settings. So for example, the get anti-aliasing text here, I had put the switch in and I put these return nodes, and this is actually really more work than should be, and I completely forgot about this. So I'm going to get rid of that and just leave one return node. What we can do from here is if we drag off of our anti-aliasing, we can search for, I'm going to just search for a string, and there's going to be the enum to string. And we can go ahead and plug this into the return value on our return node and connect that. And what this is essentially going to do is it's just going to go ahead and read the text for the setting here. So based on when we open up our enum and we have our high, medium, low enum, this text is going to be extracted out. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to replace the functions here. I'm going to copy this, and then I'm going to go in and we'll set it up for our post-processing text and all the other settings as well. So it's a little bit easier, and I put a note in the comments of the last video, but I'm not sure everybody saw it or understood it. So I'm just going to go ahead and do this. And at this point, I'm just going to close out all of these bindings. And I'm going to go ahead and compile and save. And if we hit play, we can go in and we can adjust all these settings. It's going to save all our settings for us. And we can go ahead and apply them. We can adjust the sound values, and it's going to save those. And we can adjust the controls as well. So we can set the mouse sensitivity value and the invert mouse value. If we go ahead and hit back, and I'm going to go ahead and hit exit, and we have to set it up to automatically apply the settings when the game starts. So I'm going to go into our main menu here, and we're going to go to blueprints, and we're going to open the level blueprint. And right now we're just getting the player controller, we're getting the HUD, we're casting it, and we're setting the current widget. But we also want to go ahead and do our save settings as well. This is going to be the first map that loads up when the game loads up. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to right click and I'm going to get the game instance. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to cast this to our 3P game instance. And then I don't think we're going to necessarily need to save the instance, so I'm not going to go ahead and promote it to a variable. But we are going to go ahead and check to see if a save game does exist. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to apply our graphic settings. And we're going to have to get our save settings. So from our as3p game instance, we're going to go ahead and get save settings. And we're just going to plug the save graphic settings into there. And we'll rearrange this a little bit better. And I'm going to drag this out of the way a little more. And I'll replug in what we had there before for our player HUD. So what we're going to do now is when this map loads, our main menu map, the first map of the game, we're going to go ahead and we're going to get our game instance, and then we're going to cast it, and then we're going to go and check to see if our save game settings exist. Now, if you remember, in this, we ended up, if the save settings does not exist, it's going to go ahead and create one for us. Then we're going to go ahead and we're going to get our save settings. So if we had one in there from setting it before, or if it just created from the basic one, and then we're going to go ahead and apply the graphic settings. And from there, we're going to go into creating our HUD as we did before. So if we compile and we hit play, this is the weird part where it doesn't always apply the graphic settings for whatever reason. But if we really want to test it out, I'm going to go ahead and close this, and I'm going to hit Save All. And to really see it actually in effect and be effective every time, you're going to have to go up to Play and the drop-down arrow to the right of it, and you're going to have to select Standalone Game. And this is going to launch it as if it were a standalone program running. So it goes ahead, and it does apply all of our graphic settings for us. And we can go into the settings and see what they are. And we can pick up all the values, and we can hit back. And if we go ahead and exit out of the game, and we go ahead and play it again, it's going to relaunch it. And we can double check and make sure it saved all of our settings. Now, if we go into new game, this is obviously going to break up our heads-up display. So I'm going to do a video on fixing our heads-up display, because if we change the resolution right now, this is going to look all messed up. So I'm going to Alt F4 out of this. So I'm going to get to a redesign of our gameplay HUD. But first, I'm going to go ahead, and we haven't actually done anything with the settings for the sound or the controls. So in the next video, I'm going to go ahead and we're going to actually use a plugin to apply our sound settings, and we're going to set our controls in our player controller as well. So if you have any questions or comments, go ahead and leave them down below, or head over to the Facebook page and leave them there. And thanks for watching.